If you didn't know, Pastor Wilmer was gone, now you know. Uh, you might wonder what this monstrosity is doing up here. I have sciatica, and I can only stand for a little while, but it's nothing spiritual about having it or not having it. But it gives me a little something to lean on, to hold on, or otherwise, well, I'll have to sit down, and you won't be able to see me if I'm sitting down on that step down here. It's been several years ago, I had preached a sermon. A lady, I don't know, was in this church, or the church I used to pastor up in Perkins, Oklahoma. I go up there and fill in once in a while. She said, you preached a sermon once that gave me a great deal of comfort, and if you ever get the chance, I wish you'd preach it again. I said, well, what was it about? She said, well, I don't remember. And I said, I do remember one thing about it. It said you mentioned the actor Charlton Heston. And I thought, well, Charlton Heston, I remember he played Ben-Hur or something like that, but I had no idea what she was talking about. Well, when Reverend Wilmer asked me if I would fill in today, I went and looked through some of the old sermons I've got, because I'm at the point now where I don't make new sermons, I revamp old sermons, and sure enough, I found the one that had, where I talked a little bit about Charlton Heston. So, does anybody, most of you people know who Charlton Heston is? Head of the NRA and a bunch of other things, stuff like that. I want to read you a little portion of scripture from the book of the prophet Isaiah, where it says, those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. And the Hebrew kind of definition of this word faint really means to collapse. Several years ago, when I worked at Tinker Air Force Base, I worked with a young man. His name was Carl, and he was a new Christian. And we used to talk together. We would share our convictions with one another. And it wasn't too long until I found out that his convictions about God, or some of his interpretations about Scripture, or the way that he looked at God, were a little bit different than mine. And this was confirmed to me one day when I came to work with a real bad cough, and I was sneezing and blowing my nose and just hacking up and everything else. And he told me with a great amount of conviction, he said, you know, you don't have to accept that cold you've got. And I didn't know what in the world he was talking about. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, disease comes from the devil, and it's a gift from the devil, and you don't have to accept that gift. And I had no idea what he was talking about at that time. I said, well, Carl, I said, I've got it. I don't accept it, I don't reject it, I certainly don't respect it, and when it runs its course, it'll be over with. And I could tell by the way he looked at me with that face, that, you know, the look of his face, he was probably thinking, if you could interpret that look, he was saying, "O ye of little faith." Carl belonged to a very fundamental church that put a great deal of emphasis on emotion and outward expression, and a great amount of emphasis on healing. I told Carl one day when we were talking about this, I said, well, you know, I know that God heals. I mean, it's all through the Bible. I witness people who have been healed. But I also think that God can heal through the hand of a doctor. And Carl thought that was kind of absurd and ludicrous. Well, to make a long story short, and you know what it means when preachers say make a long story short, and I know you can see where I'm going with this. Carl began to have some very, very bad pains in his stomach, but he was true to his faith, and he would not go to a doctor. He was praying, and he was trusting in God, and he had his church trusting in God, but the pain didn't get any better. It got so bad that he even came to me and asked me, he said, Herb, would you pray for me? Would you have your church pray for me? And I said, of course, I said I would. I could have been sarcastic at the time and said, well, why don't you just reject this pain? But that wouldn't have been the right thing to do, because he was in pain, and I really felt bad for him. Well, the pain got so bad that he finally had to go to a doctor. He'd used up all of his sick leave, all of his annual leave. He had a family to take care of, and he relented, and he went to a doctor. And he had gallstones, kidney stones, something was wrong. They corrected it, and he got his health back. But he got his health back, but he also lost his faith. You could tell when you talked to him that he really felt like God had let him down. He'd prayed for healing, but the healing never came. Well, at least it didn't come in the way that he wanted it to or expected it to. And his faith suffered greatly, and he slowly drifted away from that faith. And the last time I heard of him, he wasn't in church anymore, and he kind of went back to his old ways. That's a sad story, but it's not an unusual story. Some of you are probably familiar with the writings of C.S. Lewis. He's one of the most profound Christian writers of the 20th century. He was the author of some of those books called Narnia. You heard of the Narnia books, Narnia, whatever. I don't know what the name of it, but I know you've all heard of them. He wrote the wonderful books like The Problem of Pain, Mere Christianity, and my favorite, The Great Divorce. I read that book, The Great Divorce, at least once a year. And I didn't get to read it this year because I loaned it to a caregiver, one of the patients I have in the hospice, and I never got it back. But if I had it back, I'd read it this year. If you ever get a chance to read it, I know that you'll enjoy it too. In C.S. Lewis's early years, he was somewhere between an atheist and an agnostic. He was a professor at Oxford University over in England. He had a lot of friends who were Christians, a lot of professors, and one of his people that influenced him was J.R.R. Tolkien, the Hobbit. You've probably heard of the Hobbit books and things like that. Well, because of the influence of some of those teachers, some of his students, especially J.R.R. Tolkien, he decided that he would just kind of search out Christianity for himself. So he began to read the Bible. He began to notice other Christians. He noticed the love that they had for each other. And when he got through reading the scripture, he finally come to a point where he finally accepted Christ as his Lord and his Savior. He writes in one of his books, it was one of the most reluctant people that ever come to Christ, but he did. Early in his Christian life, he met and married a lady. I don't remember her last name. Her first name was Joy. They were married for about 4 years, and during that 4th year, she contracted cancer. And she died a very slow, a very agonizing death. And because of that death, C.S. Lewis' faith was greatly shaken. He wrote a book entitled A Grief Observed, and he wrote that under a pseudonym. But it's a very bleak, very dark, very pessimistic book. And all through that book, he questions the motives of God. Why in the world, God, could you let that happen? And finally, he went back to he went away from his expectations and his assumption about God, back to his experience with God and what he found in the scriptures, and he began to regain his faith. I say that to say here we've got 2 stories, one about a simple man in Oklahoma City who lived a very simple lifestyle, and he had a simple faith, and another that was probably one of the most sophisticated, knowledgeable Christian authors of this century or any other century for that matter. Yet they both had one thing in common. They both had certain expectations of how they expected that God would work in a particular situation. And when those expectations weren't fulfilled, their faith stubborn. It's been said that disillusion is the child of illusion. And if we live with illusions about how God acts in our life, we're in danger of suffering twice. We'll still go through those hurtful experiences. We'll still experience the grief, the loss, the death, and everything that goes with it. We will also go through that experience with a very damaged faith. We all make assumptions. We make assumptions about ourselves, we make assumptions about others, and we make assumptions about God and reality. And it seems to me, and this is just my kind of opinion, as long as our assumptions and our expectations about God and reality, if God performs like we expect God to perform, we live relative good lives, joyful lives, and satisfied lives. But when our assumptions about God and reality are mistaken, often we get disillusioned, angry, hostile, and bitter. And like Carl, many times we just throw the whole thing in. All of us in life, when we meet life crises, and we all do have those crises, a lot of us will, as Christians, some of the assumptions we have about God and the promises of God are what we hang on to. We'll sing that old song, Standing on the Promises of God. We make assumptions about those promises that we're going to be true. When Jesus, when he said, I am the resurrection and the life, I assume that one of these days that I'm going to be resurrected. Or the promise of the psalmist in Psalm 46 when he says that God is a refuge and strength, a very present help in the time of trouble. Or the words of the prophet Isaiah as he wrote to the people in exile, they that wait upon the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar, and they will soar like the wings like an eagle's. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. And those promises and scores of other promises, they lift us up. They give us assurance and encouragement when our whole life seems to be falling apart. But the question I've had to ask, and I know a lot of you probably don't ask questions like this, but I don't have it all down pat, and I still have things that I question. How does God work? What am I supposed to do when this tragedy, this death comes? How does God work? Does God work according to what I assume that He ought to do? And you know, the answers to those questions about God and reality have given us a lot of different theologies, and it's certainly resulted in a lot of different kind of churches. I know last week, Ron in Sunday school class, I don't know when he's in here, he mentioned Calvinism. I've got a couple of friends who are Calvinists, hyper Calvinists. And when I hear them that they're extreme, they seem to be telling God, and I don't know whether you know what Calvinism is, but they seem to be telling God, you know, that we're all kind of like actors on a stage. God writes all the dialogue, God plans the action, and we're nothing more than puppets on a string. They call that predestination, you know, everything that has been planned out for you. I know in one of the big churches we've got here in Sepulveda, they kind of had a rift not too long ago because of that very reason. The pastor was an extreme Calvinist minister. And he said, well, what's the use of having invitations, because it's already been preordained who's going to be saved and who's going to be lost. I've got a friend that belongs to one of the most hyper-Calvinistic churches here in Sepulveda. And every once in a while I'll see him someplace and we'll have our little discussions, and he'll tell me about Calvinism, about everything that happened is predestined. And I'll explain to him my feelings about the Wesleyan Arminianism, about free will and the things that the Church of God and most fundamental holiness churches believe in. We never do agree, but we never do part. We just have our little discussion and we leave. He believes that everything that happens is predestined. I don't necessarily believe that way. The last time I saw Marvin was a couple of years ago down at Walmart. And he was sitting there on the bench by the men's restroom, and Shirley had sent me down there to buy some milk or something that we ran out of. And I sat down and I talked to Marvin. We talked for a little while, and he gave me his views about Calvinism. I gave him my views about Wesleyan Arminianism, which is what we believe in the church, or free will, more to say. And as we were talking, I finally got asked, well, I got to go, Marvin. I said, what are you doing here anyhow? He said, well, my wife, I'm sitting there waiting for my wife. She's been here for a good hour, and I'm getting tired, and I want to go home. And I couldn't help it, and I think maybe the devil made me do it. Isn't it wonderful? We've got a devil that we can bring a lot of things on. I couldn't help it, and I said, well, Marvin, if she decides to shop until 4 o'clock in the morning, look at it this way: God predestined it. And just that when it comes, they just go with the flow and say hallelujah. And I noticed the last time I saw Marvin, he didn't have much to say, kind of walked away. There's another extreme that like people like got the Universalist churches and the Unitarian church. They kind of have a belief, a lot of deism. And I know that we've probably heard of deism. Thomas Jefferson was a deist, Washington was a deist, and what they kind of believe, like, and you've heard Reverend William talk about this, that God's kind of like a divine watchmaker. I mean, He winds the watch up and He just kind of lets it go, and we just kind of muddle our lives the best. He's kind of like a producer of an impromptu play, and He gets the curtain up, He shows us out on the stage, and we kind of muddle the best way through it, and when it's all over with, He just hangs the curtain down and says, that's all, folks, it's all over with. I've got a lot of friends who are charismatics, and when I hear them at their most, they kind of tell me that God's kind of like, He's there at your beck and call. Whatever you want, you can claim it, name it, and it'll belong to you. I don't know that I agree with that. But you understand there's a lot of different ways that people think how God keeps his promise. Now this doesn't mean that they don't love God. I mean, some of them love God as much as they have as much faith as I do. What it does mean, we just have different views on God, and we have different views on reality. And when you think about it, none of us even here all agree on everything. When you get together and talk to some of your friends in the church about God, about heaven, hell, things like that, how God works, we all have different opinions. We're all not the same. But the question I still have, how does God work? How does God keep his promises? What's my portion in it? What's my part in it? Or do you have any part at all? Or to put it in the jargon of the theologian, and I like this, how does the transcendent mystery of God, who is omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscience, break into human affairs? I wished I made that up, but I read that in a book and I wrote it down, but it sounds so good. And as I thought about it, I've kind of come to the conclusion, you can't put God in a box. God works in mysterious ways. There's all sorts of ways that God keeps his promises. And I want to talk about a few of them briefly just this morning. One way that God keeps his promises, we might call that the intervention of God. And what God does here when we find ourselves in the different circumstances, God reaches down, he kind of takes us out of those circumstances or removes the circumstances and he sets us free. And that's what we usually call a miracle. And we're all familiar with that term, miracle. And I thought about, there's lots of examples in the Old Testament where God had miracles in this, and this is where Charlton Heston comes in. I'm going to go over to Exodus chapter 14. You remember in Exodus chapter 14, the children of Israel, they left Egypt, they were on their way to the Promised Land, and they came to the Red Sea. And when they got to the Red Sea, they probably had questions about how we were going to get by that Red Sea or over that Red Sea, but they knew that God had been faithful back in Egypt in some way. He would figure out something. And as they were enjoying the roar of that Red Sea, they also heard another roar. And you remember the story, they looked back and they could hear the roar of Pharaoh's chariots coming down with 400 or 500 men with their swords raised ready to slay those people. And they cried out for God, they cried out for deliverance. And Charlton Heston picked up that rod and he stood there and he said, "Behold the glory and the power of God." But it wasn't really Charlton Heston. That's what I said during that sermon, and somebody asked me, and I thought, well, where in the world did I ever get the idea that Charlton Heston stood up and said, "Behold the glory of God"? And you all know where I got it, don't you? If you've ever watched the movie, The Ten Commandments, Charlton Heston was the one that did that. So how in the world could I make a mistake like that? But I had just watched the movie, and in my mind I still had Charlton Heston. So this is the sermon that she was probably talking about. It wasn't Charlton Heston, it was Moses. But it's a great moment in Israel's history. God opened the sea, and the children of Israel marched on dry ground across the sea. And when they got across on dry ground, if you remember the story, the ocean came back on top of it, drowned all of Pharaoh's people. That was a great intervention of God. God altered the circumstances. He made a miracle. And if I was looking for some examples in the New Testament, blind Bartimaeus was healed. Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. They would bring all these people with all these infirmities, and Jesus would touch them and heal them. And it kind of seems to me that most of the time when we think about God doing something, or when we pray, we ask him to do something, we ask about his intervention, we think of God performing a miracle. And this is only my opinion. You don't want to take this to the bank. I think for a lot of us, I think that the reason that we have that expectation comes from our childhood. I know when I was young, I have to believe when I was young, if my diaper needed changing, the people in power would come and I'd quit crying and they'd change my diaper. Or if I was hungry, the big people would come and they'd stick a bottle in my mouth and I'd quit crying. To me, as a little child, that was kind of the beginning of a miracle. The problem was solved by the big people. Every one of us here can think of something in our childhood where your parents did something for you that made you think that's almost like a miracle. At least to a child it was. I can remember I was born down, if you go down Mission Street where you come to that stoplight on line and keep on right on your left is the Spirit Bank. And right behind that Spirit Bank was where I was born. There used to be a big house up on that, and that had this big steeple. And I can remember once thinking, boy, I'd sure like to get on top of that house and see what it looked like. And my dad accidentally left a ladder on the side of the house one day because we had a leak in the old thing, and he would get up there and he would put some tire on it and some wall and nail it down. And he left the ladder up. And so I climbed up that ladder and got on top of that roof. I remember what a great time I had. You could sit there on the old chimney that didn't work. I could see downtown Tulsa. I could see Sugarloaf Hill, which used to be over here by the Brickyard. Some of you are raised here, you know where Sugarloaf Hill. And back to that was 75 years ago, and there were no trees, and I could see all there. I thought, what a wonderful thing. But I decided I better get down off that thing, and it was a whole lot easier to get up than it was down. I got down to the ladder, accidentally pushed the ladder fell on the ground, and I had to sit up there until my dad come home. No 911, and my mama told me, she said, well, that was my first experience with hell, because she said that's what you're going to catch when your daddy gets home. and that was, I'm not making this, that's the kind of way my dad was. When he finally got home, he said, how in the world did you get up there? And I told him. So he got up there and he got me down, and he said, stay off that ladder. But to me, that was a miracle. The big people came, And if you were brought up in the church, and as many of you were, you remember in the Sunday school sermons about the miracles of God and how God always intervened and made things right. You kind of grew up to believe that when there's a crisis come, well, if we have to face something that's very, very hard, that God will be there and He'll deliver us from whatever we need to be delivered from. Now, don't understand me. I don't think it's wrong to pray for a miracle. I don't think it's wrong to expect a miracle. In fact, there are many times when God does intervene in the lives of His people and in their dire circumstances. And I could go around this sanctuary, and there'd be many people in this sanctuary who tell me about when they experienced a miracle or something very similar to a miracle. If you meet a crisis in life, go pray. But I can testify that, which happened, something that happened to me about a year ago. I prayed for a miracle. I prayed when that ventilator was moved that she would take that breath again, But the dangerous thing, and this is just my opinion, the dangerous thing is to believe that that's the only way that God works, or even to believe that that's the major way that God works. If you believe that, that's to live with illusion. And if you live with illusion, you'll eventually be disillusioned. But that's one way that God does work. He intervenes, He changes the circumstances, He performs a miracle. And another way that God kind of works, it's not by intervention, but what I'm going to call interaction. And in this example, God doesn't always provide a miracle. If He does, it's because God works and we work, and God works with us to make a difference in the situation. It's kind of like, we're on a football team, and God's the owner, and Jesus is the coach or the manager, and Brother William is the quarterback, and the rest of us are the grunts down on the line. And if we all team up together, we can win. And that way, that's one of the ways that God works too. And an example of this, I could go back to the Old Testament again, chapters 3 and 4. You remember Moses as a young man, he wanted to see the people free. And like a lot of young men back, and even in this day, they sometimes take matters in their own hands. If you remember the story, Moses saw the Egyptians abusing one of his Hebrew brethren. And Moses rose up and he killed that man, and he buried him in the sea. And the next day, he saw a couple of his own people, a couple of Hebrews fighting, and Moses tried to break it up. And they said, well, who made you judge and ruler over us? So he knew that his goose was cooked in a way. Pharaoh knew exactly what was happening, and he ran for his life. He ended up in Midian for 40 years, kind of keeping sheep on the backside of the devil. On the backside of the desert, maybe the devil's there, I don't know. But what might have been his midlife crisis, God appeared to him at that burning bush. And you all remember, if you watched the movie, when he appeared to him, he said, Moses, Moses. How many in here watched the movie, The Ten Commandments? Every time that would come on when my girls were small, they loved it. Every time it would start to come on, I would always go, Dum, dum, da, dum, dum, dum. That was throughout the whole. But he came down and he said this to Moses, Moses, I've seen the misery of my people. I've heard of their cries because of their bondage. I'm concerned about their suffering, so I've come down to rescue them from the hands of the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land into a land flowing with milk and honey. And I can imagine up that time, Moses was crying, that's what I had in mind all the time, God. Go, God, go. You got it right. You can do it. And what did God say to Moses? What I'm going to do is, I'm going to send you to Egypt. You, Moses, you stand in front of the Pharaoh. You tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And about that time, if it's still a football team, he was probably said, hold, time out. We've got to talk about this, Lord. For one thing, I've been down there. They're not about to let all that free labor go. They just won't do it, Lord. They won't. Besides that, you know, I don't talk good. I stutter, and I can't do it. Well, there's this kind of little battle of wits, and Moses argues, and God has his part of it, and finally they introduce Aaron into it, and Aaron's going to speak to Moses. But Moses works with Aaron, and Aaron works with Moses, and they both work to God, and they get together, and they work with the people. And as they work together, they made a difference in their circumstances. I may be wrong, but I suspect that God could really free his people in the other way. You know, sometimes it's very difficult to always help people without hurting them. I think we call that enabling, don't we, when we do that? I think it's the term for that, you know. And God is not an enabler. It's very difficult to keep performing miracles for your people and really set them free. I told you about my dad rescuing me from off that roof one time. It was a couple of months later. Man, I thought I'd sure like to get on that thing again, see what I got to see. But he told me not to. And there was a tree that kind of right there by the house. And I got to thinking, you know, I could climb out on that limb, and I wouldn't. And I got it out here because he said, you stay off that ladder. He didn't say, you stay off that house. And if I climbed out there, I could get back on that house. And I went up it because I'd been up that tree 100 times. I was kind of like a monkey. And I walked out, and sure enough, as I walked across the limb, and it was getting lower and lower and lower. And the next thing you know, I was standing on the roof, and I said, I've got it made until I let loose the limb. And then up it went, you know. And no way I could reach it, so I was stuck again. Cried and cried. Mother said, well, you know, your dad's not going to be happy. But I waited and waited. He finally come home. He worked down at Liberty Glass, and he would walk up there, and he saw me sitting there, you know. He said, you did it again, didn't you? And I said, well, yeah. He said, I thought I told you to stay off that roof. I said, no, Daddy. I said, you told me to stay off that ladder. He didn't cry. He said, well, I don't want to talk about it. Mom's got dinner ready. I'm going to eat. I said, you got up there, get out. And I didn't think he would keep me up there all night long. But when it got dark, I was beginning to wonder, you may be wrong. So I thought, well, I've got to get down one way or the other. So I scooted down on the other side, and there was a bunch of bushes there. And I thought, well, I have no choice. It wasn't that high. It was probably 10 foot high or something like that. If I jump in those bushes, it'll break the fall. And my dad wasn't watching me. I didn't know it. And I jumped. No, don't jump. And I jumped anyhow. And they did break my fall, but I've still got scars right here from those thorns inside that bushes, you know. But he didn't create a miracle. He let me get out of that mess myself. But I'm sure of one thing, and I think this is one opinion that you'll agree with. There are a lot of situations in the home and the church and the society that are never going to be changed unless God works, unless we work, and unless we work together with God. If you look at that Great Commission, and most of you know what that is, in Matthew 28, you'll find out on both sides of that Great Commission are statements about the power and the presence of Jesus Christ. The Great Commission is introduced by saying, all power, all authority is given to me in heaven and earth. And the end of that statement, it says, and I'll be with you always until the end of the age. On one side, there's a statement of his power, his omnipotence. On the other side, there's a statement of his omnipresence. I'll be with you always. But what's in the middle? You know what's in the middle? You go. You go throughout the world. You make disciples. You tell about the love of God. I don't believe that any person ever comes to the Lord without being drawn by the Holy Spirit. But I also don't believe that most people don't come to the Lord without the thumbprint of another human being on their heart. A lot of us are here because somebody influenced you, somebody prayed for you, somebody told you about the love of Almighty God. I'm here because 3 men at Tinker Air Force Base, for the first time, that God told me that God was more interested in getting me to heaven and hugging me and loving me than he was sending me to hell and hating me. And that changed my whole life. So if the world is ever going to be evangelized, if they're ever going to find out about the love of Jesus Christ, it's not going to be done by trusting to the sovereignty of God, or it won't be evangelized by human effort. It'll only be when we work and we work together and we worship with God to make and change the lives of the people on this earth. So that's the second way that God keeps his promise, not by intervention, but by interaction, which he works and we work. But there's a third way, and this is the final way, and this will be a little bit briefer. And I don't know what to call this. Instead of intervention or interaction, I'll just call it intervention, because inter means within. And in this way, God doesn't perform a miracle. He doesn't take us out of the circumstances or take us away, nor does he allow us to make a difference in the situation. In this example, God leads us exactly what we are, but God reaches down and he does something deep down with our hearts that's a display of his power and his love and his grace. He can change it when he does that. It's something beautiful in our lives. If I was looking for a Bible text for this, it wouldn't be hard to go. I'd go to 2 Corinthians, you know the one I'm going to mention. In that passage where Paul said that he had a thorn in the flesh, we don't know what that thorn was. Every time we have a Sunday school class, we'll talk about it. Some people say it was the Judaizers that wanted to come in and have about circumcision. Others were, you know, that the people that want to hold to the law more than grace. A lot of people say that thorn was because Paul had bad eyesight, and you can see there, he said that in one scripture, you would have pulled out your own eye and given to me. Another one, he says, see what large letters I use as I write to you today. We don't know what that thorn in the flesh was, but we know that Paul prayed 3 times that it removed, and each time God said no. And you probably remember what his response was. He said, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. God didn't perform a miracle for Paul. He didn't remove the circumstances. He didn't allow Paul to make a difference in his circumstances. He left Paul exactly where he was, but he did something wonderful. It was a display of his power and his love and his mercy and his grace. One of my favorite Christian writers, a man named Philip Yancey. Has anybody ever read the book of What's So Amazing About Grace? A couple of hands go up. One of the most, I think, every pastor in seminary ought to read that. I've got that book. I will loan you that book, but you got to bring it back. You're going to get one of that. But it's a beautiful book. In one of his books, he wrote a story, not in that book. He wrote a story about a guy named Jim, who was a missionary who went to India. And when he was over in India, he contracted polio and leprosy at the same time. The work was so great and so needed, he would not seek help. He wouldn't go to the doctors they had done over there. He wouldn't come back to America to get fixed up. He stayed there until he could stay there no longer. He was brought back to America, but by that time he was just kind of a crumpled up ball of human flesh. And whenever I think about this, I thought about Stephen Hawking. He looked like Stephen Hawking probably, except that Stephen Hawking couldn't speak and Jim could. When he got back there, his friends took a lot of the doctors, but they couldn't do anything for him. He had no functions except his neck and below. At the urging, and for their sake, he allowed them to take him to some of the faith healers. And some of the local faith healers, they said their prayers over him, put their prayer cloths over him, sprinkled him with the holy water that supposedly come from the Jordan, but nothing happened, nothing changed. And Philip Yancey wrote that when you went to see him, the first thing you would see, you would be almost revulsion. There was revulsion because of his situation. You would sense pity. Here was a man, as the old hymn said, had been through the water, he'd been through the flood, and he'd also been through the fire. But when you talk to him, you know it also been through the blood. Because there was in him a display of that same power and that same grace that he imparted to Paul. There was in him a grace and graciousness that comes only from the fire of suffering. And you know, you don't see anything like that through people who are healthy at times. But when you left his presence, you know, he was just the same. But after you talked to him, when you left, your life was changed. God didn't change Jim's circumstances. He didn't allow the doctors or the faith healers to make a difference. What he did do was reach down in his life where only he could come and made a big difference with his wonderful, matchless grace through Jesus. And I can think of other people, you know, Joni Erickson, you've all heard of her, that the same thing happened to. I think the same thing happened to Carol Hammonds, who's not here today. There was that power, that grace that imparted by God that made a difference. And that too is how God keeps his promises. It's not as spectacular as the miraculous, but it's just as valid. When I begin this little homily, I refer to the word of the prophet Isaiah as he spoke to the exiles in Babylon. And he said to them, "Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They'll soar like wings of eagles. They'll run and not grow weary. They will walk and not collapse." A critic of poetry would probably say, well, he got that all wrong. Isaiah didn't get the structure right. You don't start off flying, you start off crawling, and then you walk, and then you run, and then you fly like an eagle. But you know, the older we get, sometimes we realize that Isaiah really did have it right. There are times when we trust in God and we'll soar like eagles. There are other times when we run and we don't grow weary. But there are those other times when I know a lot of you are familiar with, when we walk one step at a time and we don't faint. In the heat of the night and the burdens of life, we take it one step at a time and we make it. I think a lot of you have probably come to know that. There have been times probably when you woke up in the morning, you think, I don't know how I'm going to get out of this bed. I'm sure that Carol's had times when she thought, if I ever get out of this bed, I don't know whether I'll be able to get in that wheelchair. But you said a prayer and you did it. And you made it through the day and you knew that God kept his promise. And when you went to bed that night, you could say a prayer and know that God was faithful. Before I close, let me say this one thing. I'm certain of this, that God will not lie to you. Jesus will not lie to you. If anybody ever told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, it had to be Jesus Christ. In your own way, according to your own needs, God will keep his promises. You may soar like an eagle, you may run and not grow weary, or you may walk one step at a time and not collapse. Would you pray with me, please?